Next on KQED Newsroom. With absentee voting underway in California, a look at the race for Secretary of State, who's running and what's at stake. And 20 years later, the legacy of a controversial ballot measure that targeted illegal immigration.
The way Prop 187 was written, it could have really torn apart families.
Plus, on its 25th anniversary, we'll remember the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake and the historic World Series game it interrupted.
And the weather was amazing, beautiful Indian summer weather, golden light as the sun was starting to get late in the day. It was a picture-perfect, sort of an enchanted setting.
Good evening. Welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Scott Schaefer. Tuivu is off tonight. Tonight, with Election Day less than 3 weeks away, a look at California elections, how we vote, and the person who oversees the whole process, the Secretary of State. Vying for the top elections job are Democrat Alex Padilla, a state senator from Los Angeles, and Republican Pete Peterson, who runs a civic engagement institute at Pepperdine University. Joining me now from Sacramento, KQED senior politics and government editor John Myers. John, you moderated a debate last week between these two gentlemen. Tell us, first of all, what do you see as the key differences between them?
Well, you know, Scott, I think really the key difference is insider, outsider. Alex Padilla has been in the legislature for a number of years in the state Senate. He knows how state government works in Sacramento, has been involved in elections issues more this year than he was in years past. Pete Peterson, consummate outsider. Republican, would shake things up in a way. You know, Republicans haven't won a statewide election in 8 years in California. How they approach the job in some ways I think would be similar, but I do think that experience, insider, outsider, and of course the Democratic majority in Sacramento would be the real difference.
And being an outsider, would that be an advantage? I mean, Sacramento obviously is very much controlled by Democrats. What would the challenges be to somebody like Pete Peterson, who would have to work with the legislature and the governor?
Well, I think the bottom line for Secretary of State is there's limited power anyway. I mean, you certainly don't control the laws over elections. You don't actually control the elections themselves. Elections are conducted on the county level. You get a little bit of a bully pulpit on issues of election administration, voting rights, money in politics. So I think he would have to be an independent voice, but Peterson has won a lot of endorsements in this race. Newspapers up and down the state have said he's the guy to pick instead of Padilla, the insider. And I think it's going to be interesting. I think, you know, that could be some kind of momentum in this last couple of weeks.
And then just quickly, John, what would you see as the big issue, or maybe two, that the next Secretary of State, whoever it is going to have to tackle?
I'm going to pick one, I think, and it's because in the debate last week, and I've heard them say it before, both of them picked the same issue that they would do as job one, and that is a statewide voter database. This would be a database that we've been working on for years that would allow registrars in every county to share information fully so that we would know who actually is registered to vote. You know, people move, people die, the voter rolls have to be updated. We are some 10 years behind federal standards that have mandated a statewide voter database. We're the only state in America that is this far behind for a number of reasons, and we can talk about those. But both men say they would fix that database as job one.
All right. Well, the winner of that race will have a lot to say about how campaigns and elections are held in the future. Joining me now in studio to discuss that are Josh Richmond, Bay Area News Group political reporter, and Michelle Romero, a policy director at the Greenlining Institute. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Let me begin with you, Michelle, because you were one of the panelists in that debate last week. What is the Greenlining Institute? What's your mission, and how does it overlap with who the Secretary of State is?
Yeah, the Greenlining Institute is really about making sure that communities of color have access to the American dream, and having a voice in our democracy is a key way that happens. We're seeing voter ID law after voter ID law in other states. We need a Secretary of State who understands. California needs to be the counterexample.
Has that come up at all in this race?
A little bit. I mean, as a community panelist, I had a chance to ask a couple of questions. You know, Asian and Latino voters in California, they have the lowest registration rates and turnout at much lower rates too. So what are they going to do about that?
Josh Richmond, turnout has been low in these off-year elections. Is there anything a Secretary of State can do or should try to do?
Well, try definitely, and both candidates have talked a lot about how to try to goose that civic engagement into higher gear. it's such a multifaceted problem. It's hard to see how somebody who doesn't actually have policy-making authority can do it other than just getting out there and screaming to the high heavens, get to the polls, get to the registration. You can register online now. We have voter materials in 9 or 10 languages,
And so, as John said, use the bully pulpit.
Use the bully pulpit.
And John Myers, we're seeing in particular this year a couple of reforms already playing out. One of them is the top 2 primary. We're seeing that in the Ro Khanna Mike Honda race down in the South Bay. What's your sense of how that reform, which was implemented a few years ago by voters, how is that playing out? How is it shaking things up?
Well, I think it remains to be seen somewhat. This is only the second election cycle that we've had it. If you look around the state, and the Honda Khanna race is one great example in the Bay Area, but if you look around California, there's some 24 of these intra-party fights, Democrat versus Democrat, Republican versus Republican. There are differences, and certainly San Francisco, a state assembly race this year, David Campos and David Chu, nasty race. But if you backed up, and I would argue if you backed up to say, Nevada, and you looked at California, you don't see a lot of difference in them. They are still both liberal Democrats in a lot of ways. And so I think the real question going forward is, how do the voters use this power? How engaged can voters get? And back to what Michelle and Josh were talking about too, how do you engage more voters in that process to possibly get different outcomes and maybe get legislators who you think are more effective, more representative?
Michelle, what's your sense of reforms like the top 2? Is it something that engages folks, especially the folks you are trying to get access to the polls and getting excited about elections?
No, not by itself. I think one of the things that we heard when top 2 was going to be implemented was that, well, now the voters could vote for whoever they wanted. There was more at stake, and that's true, but that because of that, people would be rushing to the polls, and that's not the case. We need to do a lot of education. If anything, we've just made how our elections work more complicated, and we really need to break that down so that voters understand how to participate.
And Josh, of course, ranked choice voting, very controversial in Oakland. 4 years ago, Don Parada lost to Gene Kwan after many rounds of the counting. What's your sense of ranked choice voting as a way of exciting voters? Is it more exciting? Is it more confusing to them? What do you think?
I think it's exciting and confusing to them. I think it forces candidates to get out there and really engage with voters in a very different way than they did in a traditional campaign. Instead of saying, vote for me instead of that other guy, they're saying, vote for me, but if I'm not your top choice, then write me in second or third, and I think this other person is a good choice for you as well. There's a lot of coalition building that goes on in ranked choice voting. It also makes races very, very hard to predict, especially in Oakland's case when you have 15 mayoral candidates who are jockeying for the first, second, and third bits of attention on every voter's ballot.
And you could end up, depending on how you vote, Michelle, with really no say. If your 3 people you've put down aren't really in it at the end, you may not have a vote.
Right. I mean, you have to understand how the election works, or a lot of common mistakes can happen. We're seeing similar things with vote by mail. Vote by mail seems to be helping voters, but actually there's a lot of common mistakes that youth are making and not turning in their ballots on time, or that people that don't speak English very well aren't
John
signing
Myers,
them.
let me ask you a question about money in politics. It's always an issue, and certainly here in California. The Secretary of State's office runs this Cal Access website, which allows people, citizens, and others to track cash that goes into campaigns. How well is that running? You hear a lot of criticism of it, don't you? Has it been improved at all in the last 8 years under the incumbent Deborah Bowen?
Let's call it what it is, Scott. It's an unmitigated disaster. It is, and reporters use it as much as anybody. It is slow. It's hard to track the money between candidates and committees and donors. It uses a PDF system, which is clunky sometimes at best. The current Secretary, Deborah Bowen, has tried to do some of it. I don't think it's all her fault. I think Bowen has been a little quiet in the last few years, and certainly in the last few months, there have been some revelations about her personal life and her own health that may have a factor. But the bottom line here is money. The state legislature has not spent money on voting issues, and I do think going forward, whoever the secretary is and whoever these local elections officials are, there has to be money in the system to run elections. And these 2 guys who want to be Secretary of State both say they're going to fight for it. As a matter of fact, both of them said we may need a state bond measure to borrow the money to try to conduct elections better. And I think that campaign system is one example of it.
And Josh, it almost seems sometimes like the politicians don't really want to fix that system. Or at least it isn't a priority, clearly.
It certainly isn't a priority. You know, as we've seen the budget get scaled back, and then now that Jerry Brown is essentially holding the line on spending pretty consistently, much like the courts, much like other programs that got slashed deep, there's not going to be a flood of money coming to this anytime soon. I'm not so sure that it's by design the politicians don't want to be transparent about campaign finance spending. It's out there if you look for it. It's just very laborious to get to it.
Well, you know who does it better is MapLight.
MapLight,
If you
yeah.
go to votersedge.org,
So
right?
why are they able to
They're
do
doing
it?
it better
And they're
than
doing
the-
it with CalAccess data, right?
Exactly.
So why are they able to do it so much more efficiently and effectively? Is it money? They just have the resources?
Become a priority.
Yeah.
It's become a priority. It's about putting the voter first.
Yeah. Just quickly, Michelle, what would be at the top of your wish list for the next Secretary of State?
Well, I want a Secretary of State who understands that closing the civic engagement gaps in communities of color is just as important to the integrity of our democracy as something like fraud. I want someone who's going to proactively go to close the gap, make sure Latinos, Asians, African Americans are registered, that they're participating, and going to be bold about it.
All right, Michelle Romero from Greenlining Institute, Josh Richmond, the Bay Area News Group, and John Myers, KQED Senior Politics and Government Editor. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, political history was made in Los Angeles this week with the swearing in of the first Latino president pro tem of the California State Senate since 1883. Kevin De Leon, who replaces Darrell Steinberg, got his start in politics in 1994, organizing against Proposition 187.
I was raised by a single mother with a third-grade education. She migrated to America, to California, to give my two sisters and me a better life.
The controversial ballot measure aimed to prevent illegal immigrants from accessing public services, including health care and education. Now, California voters passed it overwhelmingly, but it was later struck down in federal court. Yet 20 years later, the legacy of Prop 187 is still being felt, as I found on a visit to San Diego this week. Barrio Logan, a blue-collar San Diego neighborhood sandwiched between the freeway and shipyards, is where Kevin De Leon grew up. Today, it's represented in the state assembly by Democrat Lorena Gonzalez. She was a grad student when Prop 187 was on the ballot, but as the campaign heated up, Gonzalez says her mother convinced her to pursue public service.
I think if you can identify one thing that single-handedly brought together the Latino community to empower themselves and start ensuring that people who were qualified could get their citizenship, making sure that they were registered to vote, making sure that they actually voted, it was Prop 187.
The daughter of a farm worker from Mexico, Gonzalez says her family, in fact most Latinos she knew, felt personally targeted by the measure, regardless of whether they were here legally or not. Among the most controversial proposals was a ban on letting illegal immigrants use non-emergency health care and other publicly funded services. It would also have prevented undocumented children from attending public schools, while requiring school districts to verify citizenship of all students and their parents.
The way Prop 187 was written, it could have really torn apart families. Children who were in my position here, legally born here, might be afraid to have their parent come to a parent-teacher conference. It didn't make a lot of sense, but instead what happened is it brought us together as a community.
This is the border crossing shown in a 1994 TV ad for Governor Pete Wilson. Its provocative images of people streaming illegally into California from Mexico helped propel Wilson to a landslide re-election.
They keep coming. 2 million illegal immigrants in California.
This fall, we can send a message to Washington to stop illegal immigration by passing Proposition 187, the SOS Initiative.
Pete Nunez, a co-author of Prop 187, served as U.S. Attorney for San Diego under President Ronald Reagan.
We're standing just beyond the port of entry at San Ysidro, California. It's the busiest land port of entry in the world. 20 years ago, most of what you see here today wasn't here then because it was overrun by illegal immigrants. There was no fence, there were no lights, there were no cameras. So it really served as sort of the focal point for everything that was wrong with our immigration policy.
Nunez says the measure tapped into public anger over illegal immigration.
The state of California had recently done a study at the cost to taxpayers, and it was in the billions of dollars. So the idea was we needed to save California from this ongoing invasion from Mexico.
Public outrage over illegal immigration was so strong that some Democrats, including Senator Dianne Feinstein, who was up for re-election that year, started talking tough on border security.
Many nights, 3,000 illegal immigrants try to cross this border. Our Border Patrol agents are outnumbered 60 to 1.
One of the few California Republicans who spoke out against Prop 187 was Ron Unz. He challenged Governor Wilson in the 1994 primary, warning that anti-immigrant measures were bad for California and for the GOP.
The main impact has been that the Republican Party of California, which had been the dominant party on the national level for decades, has been destroyed. There effectively is almost no Republican Party left in California. It's not a viable statewide party. And the reason for that is that the party ended up becoming viewed as incredibly hostile to the new immigrant groups in the state, who are now an important part of the electorate.
Stanford political science professor Gary Segura studies Latino voting trends.
Let's remember that what Prop 187 did was it authorized state workers to withhold government services from anyone they suspected of being an undocumented alien. And so even Latinos of several generations in the United States felt like it really was targeted towards the entire Latino population.
Segura points out that before 1994, Latinos and other immigrant groups often split their votes between Republicans and Democrats. But the fear Prop 187 provoked changed all that.
As a consequence, people mobilized. Latinos started registering to vote. Latinos got very active.
After the 1994 election, the federal courts invalidated most of Prop 187, so it was never enforced. But 20 years later, the issue of illegal immigration still sparks strong feelings in California. This summer, demonstrators protested the large number of unaccompanied minors entering the U.S. illegally from Central America.
We don't want you here!
Angry crowds in Murrieta, just north of San Diego County, blocked a bus with undocumented women and children heading to a government processing facility. It was a reminder that public concern over illegal immigration still lingers, says Republican activist Dolores Chavez Harms.
We have this high influx of kids that are coming from Central America, and Prop 187 was primarily to prevent state funds for covering public welfare for the illegal immigrants into the state.
Things have gotten worse. Illegal immigration is worse. In 1994, we had thought maybe 2 or 3 million. We now have 11 to 12 million people in the country illegally. So we have gone entirely in the wrong direction.
The political direction in California is being driven by changing demographics. This year, Latinos edged past non-Hispanic whites as the single largest race or ethnic group in California. And voter attitudes have changed too. A recent field poll found that 90% of voters supported a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who learn English and pay back taxes.
All members vote who desire to vote.
And with Latino legislators flexing their muscles in Sacramento, new laws have been passed helping undocumented immigrants. At the San Jose office of the nonprofit Siren, staff attorneys advise clients on how to navigate the new legal landscape. One new law allows undocumented immigrants to get a driver's permit starting in January. And young people who came to the U.S. illegally can obtain work permits without fear of deportation. Assemblywoman Gonzalez marvels at how much California policy toward immigrants has changed since Prop 187 passed.
Nobody anymore will say that a Latino immigrant or a child of an immigrant can't be part of the American dream. That's now what California expects. That is the California dream story.
Although Prop 187 was never implemented, Governor Jerry Brown signed legislation last month formally removing it from the books. The author of that bill, Democrat Kevin DeLeon. Moving on now to another anniversary. It's been 25 years since the Loma Prieta earthquake shook Northern California at 5:04 p.m. It was minutes before the start of Game 3 of the World Series between the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland A's. San Francisco filmmaker John Leonidakis was at Candlestick Park with his brother Tim, both lifelong Giants fans. John brought along his video camera to document the game. I'll be back with him in a minute, but first, a clip from his film, The Day the World Series Stopped.
Minutes before the quake struck, I left our seats to pick up some dinner. So I walked up here to get a hot dog because they had a temporary hot dog stand against the wall. I'm waiting in line with everybody for my dog, and all of a sudden, bang! The earthquake erupted underneath our feet. We could I could hear the ground groaning underneath the concrete. And I looked around to see where I'm going to hide, go to protect myself from falling debris. But there was nowhere to go because it was completely packed. Then I looked up above and I saw this huge upper lip of the stadium above me. And I said, boy, if that thing comes down, it's all over.
John Leonidakis, welcome.
Good to be with you.
Well, watching your film, I realized we have a couple things in common. I was 31 years old the day of that game. I was at Candlestick also in line for a hot dog. I remember the power went out. I stayed in line and got my hot dog. What did you do?
Well, the hot dog vendor said there's no power, so all sales are cash only. And I wanted to get back to my seat to find out what was going on and be with my brother. And so I headed back to the seat, and it was a totally different scene. It was a lot of confusion. Social media back then was just transistor radios.
Yeah, exactly, and those big cell phones. I remember where I was, for some reason, it felt like about maybe a 4.5, 5. It didn't feel like a big deal, but that wasn't the case where you were.
I would agree, because it didn't feel gigantic, because we were insulated by a giant slab of concrete. It did feel strong, but it didn't feel as bad as it really turned out to be.
And I think the worst shaking, as I recall, was up in the stands, right? There were those big concrete upper deck, which if it had collapsed, thank God it didn't, but if it had, it would have been a real disaster.
Oh, huge. And, they put in expansion joints a few years earlier, and that really made a big difference. But, yeah, those folks, they got out of there right quick.
Yeah. So, of course, they ultimately stopped the game. But we want to take a look at a clip from the film to see how the crowd reacted in that time when it wasn't really clear what was going to happen. Let's watch.
I noticed all of a sudden that the whole dish here started to undulate and go back and forth. All of a sudden, the crowd started to react. It's like, whoa, whoa, like you're on a roller coaster ride. People really didn't know how to react, and people didn't know sort of what to do next. People with TVs and radios and whatnot started to say, hey, we just had a big earthquake in the Bay Area here. You came back within maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
I remember when I came back and sat down, the scene had changed dramatically. And then the fans started chanting, "Let's play ball, let's play ball." As if to say, hey, it was just another earthquake. Let's get back to the business of the World Series.
And John, that's you with your brother in the clip. And of course, you've been to many games with your brother, including that one.
Indeed. And we were sitting in our very seats.
Yeah, yeah. And you say in the film that you felt like you dodged a bullet that day. Say more about that.
Well, we were lucky where we were. I think the people who died and the people who were injured, they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And had those expansion joints not been put into Candlestick Park, that stadium could have collapsed and I could have gotten crushed by the bowl above me, the upper section of the stands. So it was pure luck.
Yeah. The huge baseball fan that you and your brother are, of course, you probably wanted the series to resume as quickly as possible. It took about 10 days, I think, before Game 3 was ultimately played. Was that the right call?
I think so. They had to inspect both stadiums. They were still pulling bodies out of the rubble, and I think there needed to be respect shown for that. The communities needed to heal a little bit.
And what role do you think the resumption of the series, Game 3, 10 days later, had on the healing of the city, do you think?
Well, I think it helped bring people back to a sense of their normal lives before the tragedy had occurred. And I think it also allowed the two communities that were polar opposites rooting for separate teams to come together as one community and to celebrate the Bay Area that had pulled itself out of the ashes. And they pulled hope out of those ashes to reclaim their communities.
So you see, in some ways, the series was a bit of a metaphor for the city, kind of in the Bay Area, rising from the ashes, literally.
Very much so.
Yeah,
very much so.
And it kind of reminds me a little bit, harkens back to 1963 when President Kennedy had been assassinated, and there was a big controversy over whether that weekend the NFL should resume its games. They decided that they should. But you see how sports is so interwoven into our culture and our politics and everything, right?
Absolutely. And I think Pete Rozelle of the NFL said that was the worst mistake he ever made, was scheduling those games for that weekend. This, I think, was a different scenario. We really needed to get that game going again. I think it was time.
Yeah. Of course, then it was the Bay Bridge series. There was a lot of excitement. The fact that it turned out to not be the best series in terms of, the Game 3 was kind of a disaster in and of itself. The Giants, at least for Giants fans, the team lost 13-7. Would it have made a difference, do you think, if the series had gone on longer? Was the Bay Area wanting that, do you think?
That's a tough one to answer. I certainly know Giants fans would have loved for it to go.
Yeah.
I would have loved for it to go on longer. I mean, we were just swept by a team that was superior. And you know, it may have been a little bit more of a salve to the community if it had gone on longer. But I think either way, it worked out well.
Yeah, this film is clearly a love letter to the city, to the Giants, to your family, your brother. What is it about baseball that is so meaningful? You've done, I think, now 3 documentaries about baseball. You're working on a 4th.
That's right.
Yeah, what is it about baseball that's so important?
Baseball has always been a reflection of American society, and it predates the Civil War. It was the one huge constant thread and narrative that runs through American history. And I like to create documentaries that tell the human side of the game, because those typically fly under the radar, but they resonate with people emotionally. And just as we're seeing now, baseball provides a kind of drama and a kind of magic that you don't see in other sports.
Yeah, and 25 years later, lo and behold, we're back where we were in the World Series. The Giants clinching last night. They'll be in it starting next week against the Kansas City Royals. Hopefully we'll have a better outcome than we did 25 years ago.
I wish it were the A's so we could return the favor.
All right, John Leonidakis, thanks so much, and go Giants.
Go Giants.
All right, that is it for tonight. Tune in next week for our special report, Science at the Ballot Box, including a look at Proposition 1, that's the water bond. For more of our election coverage, please go to kqednews.org. We close tonight with images of the Loma Prieta earthquake from KQED's archives. I'm Scott Schaefer. Tui Vu will be back next week. Thanks for joining us. Good night.
At first light this morning, we could see that some of the devastation had been partially cleaned up. But what was left behind was still frightening, and buildings that had partially collapsed last night threatened to collapse completely.
Are you okay?
San Francisco.
Yeah, but I can't get home.
Los Angeles.
The bridge fell down.